I'm going to take you on a journey through the history of bilingual and English learner and immigrant education here in California. I've been part of the movements to try to build excellent, fantastic, just schools for English learners for the past 5 decades as a researcher, as an advocate, and first and foremost, as an educator. I actually started my education career as a high school history teacher. And once a history teacher, always a history teacher. Because I really believe, as the old saying goes, if we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it. If we don't recognize the scars and the legacy of that history, we're not going to be able to undo them, and we're not going to be able to make good on the opportunity at this moment. The thing is, English learner education has always been at the cross currents of these larger political battles over immigration, over war, over changing demographics. And it's been a history that's included cultural and linguistic oppression. It's included a kind of devil's bargain where children, as they're developing English, give up their home language. It's been a history in which testing in English on IQ tests and standardized tests have relegated English learners to inferior schooling because they didn't speak English. It's been a history of tremendous eradication of culture and language. And it has also been a history of the movements of parent activism, of passionate educators, of dedicated lawyers fighting back to create the schools we need them to be. The thing is about telling any kind of story, of a history, is it's hard to know where to begin because there's always something that happened before. And there's always far more to be told than really can be told in any one telling. So rather than think of this as the history of English learner bilingual education in California, we're going to call it a history. And the thing about a history is you have to decide where to start, as with any story. I'm going to be telling you the story of the last century, but there is always a pre-story. We, as we entered the 20th century, were a nation that was still always battling with the legacy of slavery, and we were a racially segregated society. We were a nation that was still involved with the scars of what was known as Western expansion, which included, of course, a whole set of policies and actions that involved the incorporation and the conquest of people, of land, and we were a nation of immigration. Large-scale immigration from Europe and from Mexico. All of those things affected the schools. Our schools reflected all of these patterns. So in westward expansion, Native American children were taken from their homes, from their tribes, from their families, and installed in boarding schools. And in those boarding schools, according to the words of J.D. Adkins, who was the federal Indian commissioner, the policy was eradicating students' barbarous dialects along with other remnants of their Indianness. So schools were a vehicle of cultural and language eradication. In response to the widespread immigration from Europe, with hundreds of thousands of people of many, many different language groups and cultural groups coming into the United States, the schooling system developed a whole process of compulsory attendance to see to it that these children learned the values of the new nation, that they learned the language of the new nation, and schools became, therefore, a key piece of immigrant incorporation. Civics classes, hygiene classes, and the legacy of slavery and segregation was evident in the schools, in segregated schools. Segregated black children attending black schools, and they were not just segregated schools, they were unequal schools. Unequal financing, unequal facilities, and so there was a huge movement to strike down separate but unequal schools. So this was our schooling system at the time. And even though back when the nation was started, there was no official language, in fact, the decision had been made not to have an official language for the new nation, by this time, English was firmly ensconced as the language of instruction. So this is all just pre-story. We haven't started our story yet. But you need to know this because this was the basis for what was going to happen next. There is, however, just one event that I want to share with you from this time, and that was back in 1868 the passage of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And here's the thing. It granted citizenship to everyone who was born or naturalized in the United States, which included former slaves that were recently freed. It forbade the states from denying any person equal protection of the law. And thus the 14th Amendment created the basis for civil rights in our nation. It's important to know because the 14th Amendment is the basis for everything that's going to follow in terms of the basic civil rights to an equal education. But the other thing is it continues to be an issue that is argued about in the United States. Do we provide equal protection to all people and citizenship to everyone who is born here? Okay, that's our pre-story. Now the real story begins, the 20th century. Now the real story begins, the 20th century. We entered the 20th century with tremendous economic upheaval. We were in a depression. And we all know that when there's a depression, there's a search for scapegoats. By itself, the combination of depression, immigration, would have resulted in some kind of a backlash against immigrants. But there was something else going on when you think back to that. We were in the buildup to World War I. And in the context of this continuing immigration, the United States was in turmoil. And particularly so because the largest language group and cultural group in the United States at the time was German. And World War I, the US was lining up to fight against the Germans. So we entered this era of just extraordinary language restriction and attack. Any Americans of German descent, anyone speaking the German language was suspect. All of this gave rise to just tremendous anti-immigrant sentiment and particularly a focus on Germans. Americans of German descent and culturally German in the United States were under tremendous attack under the forces of super-patriotism and xenophobia and open hostility, and there was hostility toward anything considered German. Sauerkraut was renamed. It became a rally call of the forces around the war. By the time the U.S. actually joined the war, Teddy Roosevelt, president, had said, "There can be no such thing as a German American, a hyphenated identity." He was quoted as saying, "You have to be 100% American or you are not American at all." And he warned of the danger of all hyphenated identities. English was equated with patriotism and being American. Well, you can imagine how that might affect the schools. We had German schools in many parts of the country. It was left up to local decision what language was going to be used in the schools in the Midwest. But German was out. People were jailed for speaking German. People were jailed for teaching in German. The German measles became liberty measles, and there was this mass hysteria. It was the beginning of focusing on language as the major marker of patriotism and on language as in the schools as an issue of policy. In 1911, in the build-up to the war, the National Americanization Campaign had been formed. This campaign, which was all about patriotism, focused in large part on issues of language and eradicating the German language. But using that good old 14th Amendment, parents and teachers in the Midwest sued against the restrictive language laws. And in 1923, the Meyer versus Nebraska decision was passed down by the courts. In his decision, Judge McReynolds stated that the liberty protected by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment extended to teachers and parents with respect to their children. And they quoted, "Mere knowledge of the German language cannot reasonably be regarded as harmful. The plaintiff taught this language in school as part of his occupation, and his right thus to teach and the right of parents to engage him to instruct their children in the language of their choice are within the liberty of the amendment. And then he went on to say, evidently, the legislature attempted materially to interfere with the calling of modern language teachers, with the opportunities of pupils to acquire knowledge, and with the power of parents to control the education of their own. The protection of the Constitution extends to all, to those who speak other languages, as well as those born with English on the tongue. It was the first legal challenge to the issue of restricting the language that we use in our schools. Well, despite that court ruling, that really important court ruling, nonetheless, English really gained even more stronghold in our schools. ESL, the methodology which had been developed for soldiers in war, was now used in schools to see to it that these young children learned English as quickly as possible. Pull-out classes were common for the children of immigrants, pull-out classes in which what they received was English and nothing else. It was an interesting time because it was also a time in which science was on the rise. Everything was about science, things rationalized by science, with the notion that you could measure anything, including IQ. And of course, those were IQ tests in English, used with our immigrant populations to sort and track them in schools, based on the notion, if you don't test well in English, that you're intellectually inferior, and therefore you cannot carry a regular load in school. So here we still had a legacy of restrictive language laws affecting our schools. We have the rise of science as the rationale for sorting kids. And at the same time, we were having mass deportations in the Southwest of Mexican people who'd come to the United States with the same kind of fervor that had fueled the anti-German sentiment. Mexicans keep going. This country was not in the mood to be open to people of other languages and cultures. And the dynamics about language were never just about language. They were about the people who spoke those languages. As these mass deportations were going on, as science was being used to sort and track on the basis of language, one of the first civil rights organizations emerged. In 1929, LULAC, the League of United Latin American Communities, was founded. And one of their chief missions was to end the sorting and the segregation of Mexican children in the schools of the United States. These science tests and the rationale of science was used as a rationale for segregation. It was used as a rationale for the placement of students who didn't test well in English into classes for the mentally handicapped.